Hey friends, we are going to finish the Song of Sky and Sand today. But before we do that, I want to point out to you what is in Google Classroom as your assignment today. So you're going to find this asking questions sheet because your focus today is about asking and answering questions to a text as proof that you can understand what you've been reading. So I'm going to be thinking, okay, we're going to have you start in just a minute. We're going to pause the video and you're going to open up this assignment and we're going to write down questions I have before I start reading. So you can just put a little bullet, which means just a little dot, to kind of make a list. And you can start with a question that you might have before we write the story. You might think of 2, you might think of 3, right? However many things you're wondering about before we start. And then as we're reading, I'm going to ask you to pause the video and write down a question that you might have so far in the story. So if you have a notebook that you can maybe take some notes in and jot down your thinking along the way, call those stop and jot. Or you have a sticky note, you might write down a question that you have as well. And then when we're finished, okay, your assignment will be to go back and write down any questions you have after we finish the reading. Asking questions, right? Readers can think of what's called the 5 W's if you're thinking about what kinds of questions to ask. They can be questions that start with a who, or a what, or a where, right? This is location or time, place, like the setting, when, and why. So think about questions you could ask that begin with those 5 W's to kind of help you along the way. All right. So before we start to read, I want you to pause the video and I want you to write down a couple of questions that you might have before we start reading the Song of Sky and Sand. Okay, if you remember too, when we read it, we learned a little bit about the location where they were. It talks about the West African heat. We noticed that with the illustrations, right? These trees look a lot different. There are huts, there are some kinds of mountains. We look at the color of their skin. They have to walk to get water. If you remember, so far in the story, we've learned that there's a song that's going to help Ramada and her cousin Yusuf as they're on their journey to get water for their village. Right, here's some of their family members. Grandma, remember, asked about the song that Ramada was chanting, and she realized that she had heard that song when she was a little girl. And then in the morning, Ramada woke up and she realized that it was a riddle. It was going to help them find water for their village. Okay, where we live, we don't call it a village, right? But in other countries, they may. So remember, they found the warrior, Ali, and they're following some clues to try and find out a spot where they can get water. Okay, so before we start chapter 4, I want you to go ahead and pause the video, and your job is to write down a question or two that you have before we start to read this story. All right, I'll see you back here in a minute. Okay, chapter 4. Grandma was thrilled when she heard about the children's quest. She said she would travel with them, and Ramada had no choice but to agree. Ramada suspected that Grandma wanted to keep a close eye on them, but even Ramada had to admit that Grandma's knowledge of the old ways might be a help. They decided to set out at dawn the next morning. When dawn rolled around, even the donkey seemed excited by the preparations for the journey. Maybe he sensed the hopeful spring in Ramada's step as she put on his harness and patted it carefully with folded rice sacks before she loaded up an empty barrel and hose. So it said in the story that this was dawn, so that's before the sun comes up. So you can see the sun rising, right, in the east there, and you can see the donkey. It's still dark. There's a little bit of a glare. But she's putting his saddle on there. Before they set off, Yusuf tied a metal rod onto a length of string. He held the string up high to line it up with Ali's sword. When he looked to see where it met Then he looked to see where it met the horizon. So you can see, remember, his belt and his sword. There, he said, pointing. We need to head for the second dune left of the baobab tree. There was only one container of water left in the village, but the elders insisted that the children take it with them. Ramada's mother handed Ramada the family's flashlight. In case you end up traveling at night, she explained. So there's a picture of her mom right there, handing her that flashlight. Remember last time we talked about the illustrations and how important they are in helping us understand the text. The villagers wished them luck and waved, and all the three explorers set off toward the shimmering sands of the Gourma Desert. Ramada and Grandma sat on the cart, and Yusuf walked alongside. Before long, they were deep in the desert, and the village of Simbai was a distant speck on the western horizon. So you can see them, right? Grandma and Ramada on the cart, and you can see Yusuf down here walking beside them. At midday, they reached the dune that Yusuf had pointed out. They led the donkey up to the ridge and looked around them for signs of water, animals, grass, or buzzing flies, but all they saw was sand. Grandma opened the container of water and passed it to Yusuf. Drink well, she said. If we limit ourselves to tiny sips, we'll soon get tired, and then we'll go crazy and die. Yusuf took a few big swigs and passed the container to Ramada. When the water was finished, Yusuf climbed up onto the cart, and Ramada took her turn walking. You can see a little bit better there. I can get my glare. They trudged along the ridge of the dune, down the windward slope, and up another one. The stars had long disappeared, so instead they used the sun to navigate, keeping their shadows over their left shoulders. So what do you think the crooked hand is? Asked Yusuf. It must be something you can drink from, said Grandma. An oasis, maybe, or a river. How will we know when we're close? Asked Yusuf. Look out for the birds flying in circles, Grandma said. An oasis always attracts birds. And friends, an oasis is a special spot in the desert where water is found. Okay, it could be also called a spring or sometimes a watering hole. As the afternoon wore on, a mountain loomed into view. That, said Ramada, pointing, is our last chance of finding water. From the top of the mountain, we'll be able to see for miles around. If there's an oasis anywhere nearby, we'll definitely spot it. And if there's not, she trailed off into silence. The whole village was relying on them. Failure was not an option, and she knew it. Okay, friends, if you have had some questions as we're reading, if you're wondering things, if you're wondering some who questions or what questions, where, when, or why questions as we read that first chapter, go ahead and pause, right? And write some questions down that you might have during reading. Chapter 5. 2 hours later, thirsty and exhausted, the travelers arrived at the foot of the mountain. You stay here, Grandma, said Ramada. Make sure Donkey doesn't wander off. We'll climb the mountain and try to locate the crooked hand. The children made their way around to the east side of the mountain. It was much cooler in the shade, out of the sun's heat. They kicked their shoes off and began to climb. The east face was split down the middle by a deep crevice. Ramada squeezed into the crack and edged her way up. There were good handholds and footholds all the way up, so it was not hard to climb. Hey, some of those words are a little tricky, but if you can see the picture, right, here's a big crevice, it's a big crack, and they're climbing up and getting footholds and handholds, places they can grab onto. Yusuf followed close behind, panting and muttering as he went. At last, They reached the mountain peak. They rested briefly, then stood up and looked around. Oh no, breathed Yusuf. This isn't good. Are you wondering anything right now? If you are, pause the video and write down a question you have during our reading. They could see for many miles in every direction, but there was no sign of water at all. Nothing but dry dunes and dead trees as far as they could see. Ramada stayed silent. She knew that if she tried to speak, she would cry, and she did not want to do that. She slumped back on the rock and stared dry-eyed at the cloudless, rainless sky. This desert journey, which had begun in such excitement, had come to nothing. And now, with their water container empty, how would they ever get back home to Simbai? As she lay there, a red-chested sunbird flew overhead. Once, twice, and then a third time. It seemed to be circling. Ramada quickly sat upright. The bird gave her hope. "Look up, Yusuf," she gasped. The sunbird circled a few more times, and then it landed on the mountain top and looked at the children with interest. I wonder, why is she excited that there's a bird? Do you remember about reading anything about birds? Think back. The end of chapter 4. I believe that's when Grandma said something about the oasis and birds. Remember what an oasis is? It's like a spring or a special spot where there's water in the desert. I wonder if that's what she's thinking when she sees that bird. Okay? If you have questions, make sure you pause and write them down. Down at the bottom of the mountain, Grandma was yelling what sounded like fingers. "What are you screeching about, Grandma?" shouted Yusuf. "I just walked around the mountain," Grandma shrieked back. "That crack you climbed up. There are 3 others like it. You see what this mountain looks like?" Look at the picture of the mountain. What does it look like? Look, here they are, way up on top. They were up there when they saw the bird. What does this look like? 5 fingers pointing up to the sky. "I don't believe it," whispered Ramada. "Do you think the mountain could be the crooked hand? Do you think that looks like a hand? Looks like fingers pointing toward the sky?" The sunbird flew away from them and disappeared down a wide hole. Down it went, through layer upon layer of rock, and the children rushed after it, grazing their knees and elbows, but hardly caring. Ramada seized the family flashlight from her pocket and flicked it on, heart pounding in her chest, desperate not to lose the bird. They moved quickly, skittering down through the mountain like rock lizards. So there's the bird in front of them. I love that they're talking about they were skittering down through the mountain like rock lizards. They're comparing themselves to rock lizards. That's called a simile. When we compare things using the word like or the word as, that's a simile, showing how things are the same. Far down, the shaft widened, and the children tumbled out into what seemed to be a natural cave inside the mountain. To their left was a glorious circle of sunlight shining through an entrance to the cave. You can see it right there. That's why these illustrations are so important, because if you just read the words, you might not picture that in your head, right? Or maybe you have trouble reading the words and you can't visualize what that would look like. The pictures are there to help you. To their right stood the red-chested sunbird. See him right here? The bird hopped up onto a narrow ledge and lowered its neck to drink. There before them was a natural spring, clear, cool water emerging from the rock and cascading down into the belly of the mountain. So when something's emerging, it's coming out of, okay, it's cascading. So think about what a waterfall does. It flows down. That's what cascading means. So as it had done for hundreds of years, they gazed, transfixed, while the sunbird drank. And then, with cries of joy, they flung themselves forward and gulped great mouthfuls of water from the flow. What do you think they were feeling at this point in the story? You need to pause the video. Surely you have some questions. You're wondering some things. So you're going to jot those down where it says during my reading. Okay, and then we're going to finish the last chapter. You're going to have a chance to ask some questions about what happens next. Chapter 6. It was late at night when the weary three arrived back home in Simbai. As soon as the thirsty villagers heard the rattle of donkey cartwheels, they jumped to their feet and ran to greet the travelers. It's kind of hard to see because it's dark and it's nighttime, but you can see the donkey right here, right? And they're up here on the cart, and then all of the villagers coming to greet them. How did it go? The villagers asked. Did you find the crooked hand? Grinning all over their faces, Ramada and Yusuf told their story. The villagers listened, enthralled, gasping at the difficulty of the journey, and finally cheering in delight. Once we found the spring, the rest was easy, Ramada concluded. Yusuf fetched the hose, and we used it to channel the water down the side of the mountain. Grandma made sure that Donkey was standing in the right spot, and the water flowed straight into our barrel. The villagers drank their fill from the barrel, and then they started to dance and sing. The children felt themselves swept off the ground and hoisted onto their aunts' and uncles' shoulders. Somebody was even carrying Grandma, whirling her round and round delightedly. The village was saved, and it was time to celebrate. Look here, you can see people on the ground. These people are in the air. See the stars as well, so you know that it's nighttime. We'll go back tomorrow and fill another barrel, Yusuf called to Ramada. There's enough water there for everyone in Simbai. Enough for Hundi, too, said Ramada. They let us use their pump when water was short, so now we'll let them use our spring, the spring of the crooked hand. The spring of the crooked hand, sang the villagers. The spring of the crooked hand. Lift your eyes from the dust dry sand to the spring of the crooked hand. All right, so now your job is to go back to your Google Classroom assignment, okay, and thinking about how the story ends. What questions do you have after we've finished the story? Okay, and when I ask you a question about after reading, it might just be a chapter sometime, or it might just be a couple paragraphs. This one happens to be the entire book. We finished it. It was a pretty short story, so we finished it in 2 days. Okay, but I want to know, what questions do you have after we finish the story? And if you need some help, think about these 5 W's, right? That might help you to think of questions that you want to ask, right? Good readers ask questions before, during, and after they read a text to help them understand the story.